Okay, so we're ready to go again. I want to go ahead and talk about this while it's still fresh on the mind. And it comes off of what I talked about last time. The process of unfolding, of becoming who you want to be. But now I think we should drill down a little bit further into looking into what exactly the process of doing something like that might look like. And for me personally, given the circumstances that have come to define my present moment, I feel like it's something that could be based on a couple of things. Recognition of what your goals are, and understanding the correlation between the actions that you take and your ability to achieve those goals. Now, this is something that I guess could be considered to some extent what people would call magic or alchemy. And that might be a little bit of a dramatic way to phrase it, but I think it's relative. It's relevant to the discussion. And relativity plays a part in it too, as we'll see. Now, how would I define that process? On the basic level, it's the ability to recognize that there's a direct correlation, a direct correspondence between your patterns of thinking, your thought forms, and the material reality, the physical world that you see around you. Now, for somebody who's yet to acknowledge this and yet to maybe make that connection, it can seem a lot of the time like the world and their life and their circumstances are just simply happening to them. And that there's no underlying force, there's no directing mechanism, and it's just simply happening to them. Now, obviously, that's a problem. We can't live our lives like that. Well, we can, but the longer it goes on, the more we'll feel victimized by our circumstances. So the goal really then is to understand that this is a process. This is a logistical framework that you can take conscious control of. And that when you understand what it is that you want, and you understand how this thing works, you can achieve the outcome that you desire. Or at the very least, you can guide your situation closer to that you're seeking. And now what's fundamental to wrapping your head around that sort of concept? And I think it could be most simply put as this. In your mind, all your concepts and perceptions and rationalizations about the world are all completely relative. That is to say that you define things, you perceive things, and you consider things, and yourself as well, through their relationship to other things. Your conscious experience and your material situation are all defined relative to how you have a conception of them. I know what I am, I know what I'm doing because of its relative position to what somebody else is and what somebody else is doing. And they look at it the same way. So that could present somewhat of a dilemma if you're not actively defining for yourself what those things are that you're doing, what your situation is. If you give control over to someone or something else, you'll end up being controlled by it. You're letting somebody else's experience, somebody else's reality define your own, relatively speaking. If you put yourself at the mercy of somebody else, then you can expect for there to come a time when they won't take mercy on you. So the goal then is taking control of how you're defining yourself in your life, having a clear conception of what your goals are. And then you'll see that the relativistic nature of things will start to respond to that. And you won't be able to be defined quite as easily by someone else. And you'll see that things around you start to define themselves relative to you instead of the other way around. But don't get it confused. This is not about controlling other people. This is not about manipulating other people. This is about controlling yourself. Being in control of your own situation. Starting with the situation inside your own mind. And then, as we'll see, that matriculates outward into your physical reality. And I probably don't have to tell you this, but it works just as well when you're not acknowledging it as when you are. If you don't have a clear conception of who you are, if you don't have a clear conception of what your goals are, that's going to leak out into the world around you, into people's perceptions of you and how they define you relative to their own situation. And so obviously the goal then would be to have a clear conception of your own identity, to have a clear conception of what your goal is, your target is in life, and let that matriculate outwards. And you'll see that the material situation around you and the people around you will not help but to be able to acknowledge that. And you'll start to see that dynamic, that relationship of definition, relatively speaking, change in line with what it is you've set out to do. And I think it is once you do that, once you have that clear definition of yourself relative to the outside world, once you understand who you are, and that's what sets you on the path. That's when the work begins. And this is what is incumbent upon each of us to do. Because if we don't, then we'll always be at the mercy of circumstance. We'll always feel victimized by our situation. And I think, well, it's becoming clear to me that I know calling back to the previous talk, this is the beginning point. This is the basis for that success, for that definition of yourself as you envision it. This is where it starts. And so how does somebody go about defining themselves? Well, as we spoke about last time, it's in terms of finding out what it is that you actually want, what resonates with you. You have to start stripping away. You have to take away everything, see what's left, see what you still want to do when you can't do anything. And that'll give you some idea. That'll be what starts to give you a clearer conception of your goals as a person and for your career and your relationship and your practices. You know, what hobbies you might have, so to speak. And as far as I can tell at this point, and obviously you can take this as far along as you want, but we're just getting started out here. And so it seems that there's some basic principles that are important to recognize and integrate into your life as quickly as possible. And the first one is just that. It starts with having the clear conception of your goals, being able to clearly define yourself. Look at the end state for a particular project that you have set out on. Focus on it. Picture it in your mind as clearly as you can. And see, this is a part that was very difficult for me to figure out. Because for the longest time, I was focused on it in the reverse. I didn't feel like it was as important to have a destination as it was to be certain of the process that I was using to live day to day. You know, having a even temper, a calm demeanor, and this and that and the other. Minutia. Things that ought to be simply unconscious. That when you're doing it, you know that you're on the right path. And it is just that way. You can take care of those things. It's like driving your car and just looking at the road directly in front of you. It'll be very hard to get where you're going with any kind of confidence because you know you have a destination. And you should always be looking around the next bend, anticipating what comes next. And the things that happen in between will largely take care of themselves. And in just that way, you should expect that you'll always have to be making choices and decisions relative to these goals. And that this will be what continually refines and clarifies those definitions. So let's say you are in a job that you feel isn't fulfilling. You're in a relationship that isn't fulfilling. You have to make a choice on how to approach those situations in a way that's ultimately furthering you along your path to what your goal is. And understand that when those difficulties arise in people or in situations, that this is basically the universe showing you, putting it right in front of your face, what you need to continue clarifying. And through this process, sort of a recursive process now, that you'll burn away the impurities of yourself, of your mental state, of your material situation, that'll get you closer and closer to what it is that you want to achieve. And this is what would appear to be the goal of what you would call alchemy. Okay? You know, in the lay sense, it's referred to as turning lead into gold, as a physical metaphor for the work that you actually have to do on yourself as a person, refining, burning away those impurities until what's left is the pure, shining core of your own being, your actualized intent, manifested in the world. And it's just that. And this is something I feel like most people who are successful, at least, do with some degree of awareness, but it could be done totally unconsciously if you're lucky enough. But to consider yourself in that way, to live with that conscious awareness of the process of creation, and to acknowledge just how much of an active part you actually play in it, in creating your situation, for better or for worse. Because you could just as easily burn away all the things that are actually important to you through not acknowledging your part to play in manifesting those things. You can just as easily see yourself burned away in that fire, in that crucible, if you're not careful. It's a lot to really. You look back on your life and you'll understand that there are times when you've done this as well. And I know I have quite a bit. And of course, this calls back to what I had talked about previously. And really getting burnt up, burned alive. But for those of us who are lucky enough to come out the other side with some sense of their sanity still intact, you really have no other choice at that point but to start acknowledging these things and to start acting on them in a productive way. Of course, all this, you know, may seem kind of out there on the face of it, but we're really talking about very mundane things at this point anyway. And of course, the more you look into magical practices and things like that, there are untold libraries of rituals and artifacts and different accoutrements that you can use to help yourself in achieving these goals. And it might be worth talking about that, at least insofar as to define them as, physical acts and physical objects that you imbue with your intent. And you use them as a focal point, sort of a feedback loop that you can develop with these things to further solidify, further amplify the intent that you have for what it is that you want to do along your journey. Of course, all this still has to happen. All this has to be tempered and balanced within the laws of the physical universe that we exist in. At least insofar as they pertain to your goals. We wouldn't. We can't be expected to move mountains or raise the dead. And who would want to, really? And I think it's best put this way, is that somebody who's truly in touch with that and truly wise, they would not seek to move mountains or raise the dead, because they understand that these things arise perfectly naturally and just as they ought to be. So the trick then is to operate understanding the framework of what's actually able to be worked on, and using this process simply to optimize the results. So in this way, defined as such, magic, we don't even need to call it that. It's just about, it's just as much about recognizing what not to do and what not to act on as it is the inverse. And so, while the goal, the end state, must be as clearly defined as possible, the real trick and the real key to the logistics of the whole thing is to realize that the path towards it must allow for uncertainty and fluidity. Unlimited uncertainty, really. As long as you have the goal fixed in your mind, the definition of yourself and of your situation, where you want to end up, it's like I said, driving your car. That part will take care of itself. It can't be forced. It can't be cajoled into behaving the way you want it to. All you can control is what your focus is, your desired result. So you can't force it. But when you know what you're doing, you won't have to. So you have to actually know what it is that you're doing. You have to know where you're going. And that's the key. And I think that's the continuing theme here of all this, is finding what your calling is and not losing sight of it, not giving it over to somebody else. You can't invest yourself like that into somebody else's life. Because if you do, and you take a back seat, you are letting somebody else define what it is that you are. And you'll find that you might not always like their definition. But who could blame them? If you're not doing it, and you're expecting somebody else to do it, who could you blame but yourself? Okay. So I think that gets the basis of that out of the way. And so I think we should continue on this, ending things off with looking at some cards, seeing if we can't get this as though we would need to get it to line up with our thinking, to give us some insight on this situation. How to enact. How to set off upon the journey. Because it's definitely not. You can't be comfortable with this and not be comfortable operating in the dark at least a little bit. That is why they call it a cult, right? Because you are navigating a path that's not so well defined. It may be uncharted territory. And what's more uncharted for each of us, really, than the contents of our own mind? That's what we're hoping to illuminate here. The Fool, the Five of Pentacles, the Ten of Cups, and the World. And on the bottom of the deck we have the Death card. This is a process of transformation. The Fool card itself speaks to this whole process, absolutely. This is where you start from a beginning point and you have zero knowledge. And this card is numbered 0. You set off in total blind faith. Not faith in any process, but faith that you're on a journey that you're supposed to be on. And of course, this will inevitably lead into difficult situations, as referenced previously by the Five of Pentacles. But we understand that this is part of the process. This is part of the transformation of the self into something more. And moving on into the Ten of Cups. These are 10 cups arranged in a rainbow with a happy looking family dancing and praising their beautiful situation beneath it. In the world. This represents the pinnacle, the apex, the completion of the cycle, but also a return back to the beginning of the next cycle. If you look it up, you'll see a laurel wreath around this goddess type figure. And that leads us back in to the 0 card of the Fool, which comes directly after it. And the Death card in Tarot is not about a physical death. It speaks to the completion of these cycles and the necessity of this process for us all to have to go through, to actualize and to manifest the things that it is that we want. It wouldn't be possible without it. It speaks to transformation, new beginnings, and seeing an end as a beginning simultaneously. And that's what the whole thing is about. There isn't really an end state. Everything happens in its own order, to its own end. And that's just the beginning of something new. And so it's up to us to decide on the degree to which we want to become active participants in that process. And these are just some of the tools that we can use along that journey to help maybe get a little more definition as to what it is that we are really capable of. Okay, so I think that's enough for now. Again, I hope that this is useful. Certainly useful for me. Take time every day to just write it out. What it is that you're thinking, what you're feeling. Solidify it in your mind. Don't let it pass you by. Those creative ideas, those interesting thoughts, don't let them pass you by. Put them to paper, record them, if only for yourself, because you'll be able to use that and it'll help you so much. Okay, so until next time, take care.